Yeah, so luckily I don't need to introduce the Chaos Computer Club anymore. We have been a hacker organization that happened to transform into an NGO. So I'm very happy to introduce Evgeny today. We have something in common, which is that we both grew up in the East. I grew up in East Berlin. Evgeny grew up much further east in Belarus. And I think that this perspective of having seen totally different systems, political systems, than our current system, gives a clarity of perception and an ability to see through a lot of the smoke and mirrors that are erected around today's debates, especially in the digital domain. If you have seen a system basically that seems invincible, and all-powerful crumble and totally transform and became something entirely different, then you accept that this can actually happen to systems that are existing today. And so the question of how technology and society shape each other today is basically one of the most important debates that we can have. And Evgeny has always been at the core of this debate in the last years in Germany, especially since I think growing up in Belarus also gave you the courage to say uncomfortable truth in a loud voice and do not really care if people like it or not. And I liked it very much. So, you know, the digital debate in Germany is quite different from that in the US. So which has of course a lot to do with our history. So we Germans are much more privacy-centric. We see the right to privacy as sort of a balance of a lever against power, against larger entities, being it governments or larger corporations. And we strongly believe in the precautionary principle, which is probably something that will be totally alien to most libertarian US people. And we somehow are culturally inclined to distrust bold claims of future utopias. So, and which seems to be very difficult to understand, especially for most of the participants of the digital debate in the US. And this tendency has, of course, drawbacks. So, I mean, look at Germany today. Germany is trying to find somehow its place in the digital world, struggling with that both economically and politically and philosophically. We're not really at home in this new era yet. On the other hand, this conservative attitude also allowed us to somehow avoid some of the larger pitfalls, like building up a 50 billion a year spying apparatus. We somehow avoided that at least. And so coming from that background, Evgeny's perspective and ideas were kind of a natural fit for here. So his first book, The Net Delusion, The Dark Side of Internet Freedom in 2011, he exposed the fairy tales of these Twitter revolutions. So we all knew that we were very excited for a week or two that somehow regimes could be crumbled and toppled by just applying the right amount of technology at the right time. And Evgeny helped us to see that this was just a fairy tale. Basically, it was a very brief moment in time where the dictatorships of this world simply didn't yet master the digital tools of power. So they did shortly afterwards. And if you look at the outcome of these revolutions, or whatever you want to call them in Northern Africa, they are not really pleasant for anyone. So this basically contrarian position at the time made Evgeny very well known in the circles of digital debate here in Germany. And the streak that was behind it was, of course, the idea that applying technology to political problems or to social problems or economic problems could somehow work. And then Evgeny went further, exposing that in a second book, 2013, To Save Everything, Click Here, The Folly of Technological Solutionism. And I really like the word solutionism, because it is basically the Twitter revolution fairy tale has been exactly that. It was basically the idea that a solution to political dictatorships could be in applying technology, finding a solution, just have an app that solves the problem, which turned out not to be true. And so Evgeny wrote that second book on the role of Silicon Valley behind that solutionism idea. And what was very enlightening for me was to understand there that the fundamental beliefs and the philosophical conceptions of the people who run these large corporations are actually shaping our world through the technology that they build, that they bring forward. And that this belief from Silicon Valley, I'm simplifying here, of course, that having the right app could solve all the problems in the world, or having the right type of technology, was just a charade. So if you look at the likes, for instance, of Uber today, or like Airbnb, they're basically saying, okay, we solve two problems at once. We solve public transport or urban transport, and we create a lot of jobs. That's what Uber is saying. And what in reality, what they're doing is they're just applying the right amount of technology to essentially circumvent local regulations in a way that is profitable to them. And this is, for me, the heart of what's called disruption. And so this is something that Evgeny has been constantly exposing in his works, which for me was very important to find it spoken in such a strong voice. So I mean in both sense of the word. So one thing that I personally learned from Evgeny's books was that the technology and social changes in politics can never be, again, debated separately. They are intertwined in a way that the world that we live in is inherently both, or all three things. We have social dimensions, political dimensions, technological dimensions, all intertwined with each other, and the debates must be brought together. This is what Evgeny is very good in. So the next problems that we face, both in the smart cities and the Internet of Things that we will talk about today, but also on a larger scale of quantifying our world, putting sensors everywhere and learning everything that we know about our world, will have profound implications in politics, in social area, in economic domain, for our jobs. And we need to learn to bring these debates together and frame them in a rational way. And I'm happy that Evgeny is here to bring this debate forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank, for this wonderful introduction to my work over the last, I guess, 4 or 5 years. It's probably one of the best I've heard. Thank you so much for the Academy for hosting me here and for providing an excellent place to think and write and research. Thank, of course, to the Bosh Foundation, which is funding my fellowship. I think I have about 40 minutes to give you a very quick talk, and as you know, I talk very fast. So if it gets too fast, just start making noises. And it's going to be somewhat technical because I see we have a very diverse crowd in this room, and I don't know how much all of us know about smart thermostats, and I wish we actually had one of those in this room because it's so hot, and other devices and gadgets that belong to what's now called as the Internet of Things. So I'll try to give some of the sort of background introductory remarks just to situate all of us on the same page before we jump into the actual political, economical, and social implications of these technologies. So I would start perhaps with an anecdote which will bring up both the value of putting all those sensors that make up the Internet of Things everywhere, but also the difficulties we encounter in using terms like the Internet of Things. So last year in Portland, Oregon, a city that's well known for its excellent public transportation and very active civic participation of its citizens in how the city is run, there was a very interesting new initiative that came out based on the interests of the cyclers in Portland, who were using a particular app called Stava, which is an app which allows you to basically collect the data as your bicycle goes through the city or through the neighboring area, and then share that data with other bicyclists, so to upload it online, to identify more challenging and interesting routes, and basically to rely on the fact that your smartphone now carries a sensor to be able to map out the actual route that you are traveling through. And what city planners in Portland understood, having encountered this community of bicyclists, was that the data that is gathered by this app, in a way that was entirely unanticipated by people who actually built it, could be very helpful in trying to improve the urban planning process in Portland, because it actually shows where the bicyclists tend to go most often, which bike lanes they actually take, where they will prefer to go as opposed to where planners think they go. And it's basically the kind of data that can be nicely incorporated into the overall urban planning process in Portland. So the city authorities in Portland did, of course, the smart thing, and they made a contract with the company that built that data, and they bought a license fee of, I think, $20,000 to be able to incorporate that data from this app that wasn't, of course, built for providing such data in the first place into their overall planning process. This, I would argue, highlights the utility of the data that is being generated by the sensors. And those sensors can be in our pockets, as is the case with the smartphones that we are carrying. It can also be in our cities. The bus stops now frequently equipped with sensors. Our trash cans, if you, like me, live in Boston, you might have seen that we actually have a particular type of new trash cans that actually know when they're about to get filled up. And they indicate to the trash collecting company that it's time to empty them, so that the trash truck actually configures its route in a way to fetch the trash cans that are already full first. But again, it's much more than that, right? The same sensors, I would argue, are present in other layers and aspects of our everyday life. It's not just hardware. And I think when we hear words and terms like the Internet of Things, the immediate assumption that a lot of us make is that, well, it's something tangible. It's the proverbial fridge in our kitchen that would know when we are running out of milk and place an order to our supermarket and have that milk delivered. I mean, 20 years ago, we heard that story with milk being delivered by, I don't know, a bicycle, and today it will probably be delivered by a drone. But it's the same anecdote that has been sort of informing our vision. It's hardware devices with sensors, it's physical things. I would argue that we actually probably have to go beyond that conceptualization analytically, and also think of other types of sensors which might not actually be material, which might be virtual. I would argue that the Google search box, in a sense, is a sensor of sorts as well, because it understands what it is you're trying to find. It stores that data. It tries to understand you. So in a sense, it's a sensor that is attached to you and not to the trash can, as was the case with the example I gave you earlier. And if you open up this analysis to the kind of level of abstraction that I'm urging here, you would see that perhaps we should not focus too much on the Internet of Things as a collection of smart objects and artifacts, but to think much broadly about the types of data that different types of sensors produce. Because ultimately, this is how the companies that are rolling out their services think about those services, right? Think about those platforms, whether they are hardware or software. That, by the way, explains why a company like Google would operate an email service and a search engine, but also the smart thermostat, as you know, and the smart smoke detector, which they now do, having bought the Nest company, but also relies on other types of sensors, including those that are present in our smartphones, right? The way in which Google calculates, for example, real-time traffic data about how long it would take for you to get from point A to point B when you go to Google Maps is partly by drawing on the data supplied by your smartphones. right? Which are Android phones, which again inform how fast the traffic lane is moving, right? So all I'm trying to say at this very sort of start of my talk is that we should not confine ourselves to specific analytical categories. We have to think of sensors as being very different kinds, but also we should not fixate on the Internet of Things, just something disconnected from other forms of data connection, right? In a sense, you can argue that the proliferation of different buzzwords, the sharing economy, big data, variables, the Internet of Things, I can probably continue for a good hour with this buzzwords. In a sense, it conceals many of the rather straightforward processes of data collection that are happening, right? And that data collection, I would argue, is happening for reasons that have to do partly with the transformations in how a lot of businesses operate today. All of them want to be much more customer-centric, to use the buzzwords, or to be much more adaptive to their customers, trying to, in a sense, preempt and generate a desire for their product in advance by constantly personalizing their offering, and that requires continuous data collection, whether the data collection is happening by monitoring your email, by monitoring what you're doing on your bicycle, or by monitoring your smart mattress, and I'll get there as well. Or it's happening at the government level for reasons that, as you all well know, have to do with surveillance, or, which I think is an aspect that is often overlooked in this regard, for guiding and shaping the behavior of citizens. And it's this aspect of guiding our behavior, whether you could call it nudging, as a lot of political and legal theories increasingly do, who come out of behavioral economics, or whether you call it by any other name, I think the ultimate result here is the same. And I will actually spend a good chunk of my talk trying to flesh out that aspect. But the reality here is very simple. In a sense, the fact that you can collect a lot of data about individual users also allows you to make predictions about what they will be doing in the near future, but it also allows you to shape their behavior, because all of these devices that we are using, they are not just passive, right? They do not just record data about you. Since they have a screen, since they're interactive, they can also act back on you, right? They can understand what it is that you do, and they can make the intervention at the right point of at the right time in your everyday cycle, so to say, and show you that you're not eating enough, or you're eating too much, you're not exercising enough, you're not sleeping enough. All of that becomes possible since not just data is being collected, but the data is realized in real time, and it becomes possible to act on that data with some kind of a intervention, right, based on the screen that you're looking at. So with that sort of theoretical work out of the way, let me just say a few words what I'm working on at the moment. For me, a very big task ahead is to understand the ways in which it's not just new ways of control that are enabled by these devices and platforms. I mean, right now, this is the dominant paradigm. I mean, to me, it's undeniable, as I've said, that many of these platforms, gadgets, and systems are being used to shape our behavior. They are being used to make sure that we consume more, whether it's more films recommended to us by the Netflix algorithms, or whether it's more stuff recommended to us through Amazon. But this is just the dominant control paradigm with which I think we have grown up in this debate, plus young people, of which there are many in this audience. But I would argue that there is a different paradigm, and we also need to start exploring it. And it's the way in which many of these devices and platforms and systems can actually be repurposed and re-engineered. And when I say re-engineered, I don't just mean the kind of shallow solutionist interventions I myself have criticized in the past, but I actually mean specific legal, political, and social interventions that might happen at the level of, for example, data ownership or infrastructure ownership, that would make sure that some of these devices and platforms and sensors could actually contribute to the well-being of citizens, communities, and projects that are not just about increasing consumption or controlling how we behave or allowing the NSA to catch terrorists, right? I would argue that the rhetoric that we now see emerge, whether it's around big data or the Internet of Things, I mean, some of it is extremely shallow, and some of that is extremely solutionist, to use the term again. but some of it is actually quite genuine. There are new possibilities for social organization, for more efficient use of resources, for more efficient use of energy, for more effective use of public transportation that do emerge from the fact that now we all carry sensors in our pockets, and we all have sensors built into our everyday environment, and we all have sensors in our households. Now, of course, we would need to do quite a bit of work to make sure that the systems do deliver on the kind of civic promise that I will try to articulate towards the end of my talk. But my current research and what I want to hope to do here at the Academy focuses precisely on identifying the right kinds of interventions, legally and politically, that would enable that more utopian agenda that would not just agree and acquiesce to the path that is already put forward by Silicon Valley on the one hand and the likes of nudgers or the NSAers on the other, and would try to actually steer the development of those technologies in some different direction. So to, again, step back from this more abstract talk of my project, let me just situate you into probably the most emblematic project that most people would now associate with the Internet of Things, and that would be precisely the smart thermostat that is so advertised and celebrated by Google. So it's called Nest, and for Google, it's the flagship product that will bring more home automation into our homes. The way in which it works is very simple. It's basically a thermostat that senses, because it relies, if you listen to the story, it relies on a combination of unique sensors and algorithms to understand and be able to basically figure out when it is that you are at home and when it is that you are away. And the moment the system starts understanding that you're about to enter, right, which again, you can easily do if you rely on enough sensors along the way, it turns on, it heats up the room, and does any other things that a home automation system would, based on knowing that the user is about to enter. And that's all it does, right? And it's, the smoke thermostat works in a somewhat similar fashion, but the idea is that once you have this basic service that can learn also about what you do, it constantly monitors your behavior. It's not static. You don't have to program it. So it learns when you're at home, it learns when you're not at home, and it tries to learn from your behavior and optimize its own performance accordingly. Right? So the way in which it's now being pitched to users, and there are many, is that it's a system in which you would actually be able to cut your energy costs radically, because the system would learn when you are asleep, it will learn when you are not in the room, it will learn any aspects of your behavior and optimize itself accordingly. If you connect it to your energy system, which is also possible, to your grid, and they actually have a special program for that called AutoTune, it will actually analyze what are the most profitable moments for the electricity company to actually offer you a payment for you not to use so much energy at home because there is peak demand and there is too much electricity being consumed by other households. So the system can actually analyze not just your behavior, but by connecting to other networks, whether those are electricity networks or water networks or any other kind of networks, that can actually shape your consumer behavior in very powerful ways by giving you incentives. So if the system figures out that perhaps anticipating high demand in your house, it would be a good idea, not just in your house, but in your neighborhood, it would be a good idea to heat up your room 2 hours earlier, because this is when the rates are least expensive, and then offer you perhaps a voucher for 10 or 15 euros to suffer from the heat. A lot of people would say yes and would be kind of happy, and that will alleviate the demand that the entire system experiences, right? So all sorts of new interventions become possible because not only can you analyze the data of specific individuals, you can also, in a sense, connect it to the broader developments, not just in the energy markets, but also the financial markets at large, right? And Google now has basically turned Nest into a platform. So it's a platform that allows any other home automation device, your washing machine, your smart lights, your smart beds and mattresses, to start working with Nest, right? So every time your smart mattress, which again, I'm not making this up, there are lots of systems for smart mattresses, but this particular one is very popular. So the moment your smart mattress realizes that you are about to wake up, and by the way, if you think that waking up is a process that will be entirely in your hands, it's not really the case, because the whole point of a smart mattress is to analyze your sleep cycle so that the mattress would wake you up at the most convenient time for you, right? So it will analyze how you're moving between different sleep cycles, and it will make sure that it wakes you up at exactly the right moment so that you don't have an extra headache and you're not feeling down. So imagine the smart mattress knows that it will need to wake you up in 5 minutes. It communicates with the thermostat, and the thermostat starts heating up the room because it knows that in 5 minutes you will wake up, right? This is not science fiction, it's already working, right? So, and there are a lot of people in California who are actually buying this stuff in droves. I mean, it's not a marginal, obscure product that 3 people working in Google campus use. I mean, Nest was bought for either $2 or $3 billion. It's not a small company, right? And of course, the pitch that Google makes now is that once you buy Nest, it will pay for itself in literally 2 years, right? So the investment would pay off because your energy savings would be so great. But again, to articulate, the connections are not just with your smart mattress. You can connect anything to it. Your smart car, not even your smart car, your ordinary car. You know, you can connect your Mercedes to it. And once the system anticipates or understands that you're about to get closer to your house, your thermostat will go on, right? And it also learns your behavior, so it will also know when you left the house, so it will go off, right? So the idea here, again, is this constant monitoring of our behavior, constant adaptation with some goal in mind. And in this case, I think the goal is low energy bills. Right? That's the goal that has been programmed into the system. But if you think about the way in which Google Nest operates, it's not very different from how other Google systems operate. So if you look at another flagship Google program, which has nothing to do with, if you think about it, the Internet of Things, called Google Now, it does something very similar. And I would argue that Google Now actually is the future for search as envisioned by Google, and that all of Google's competitors in Europe who are trying to disrupt it now do not understand what Google actually has in the store for us. The way in which Google Now works, for those of you who have never seen it, is also very simple. Google Now basically analyzes everything you do with different Google services, with Maps, with Gmail, with YouTube, with search. It analyzes any emails that you get from airlines, from hotels. It organizes them, so it knows every time I book a plane ticket, it knows that I have a plane reservation coming up, and a day in advance, Google Now will remind me and will automatically check me into my flight for certain airlines. It will show me the weather at the destination where I'm going. It will remind me to take an umbrella if it's going to rain there. It will remind me that the traffic conditions on the road, because again, it has sensors everywhere, are such that I probably should leave for the airport 25 minutes earlier and not 10 minutes earlier, because again, the system more or less understands my life, right? And understands my life because so much of my life now is highly structured. My hotel reservations come in a certain form that Gmail understands are emails from hotels. So it automatically knows what are the hotels where I'll be staying, right? And it basically integrates all that data. Every time somebody writes an email to me and they say that we are going to have a meeting at 3 p.m. on Tuesday at this cafe, Google knows that there is a meeting coming up in my life at 3 p.m. in this cafe, and Google now asks me, do I want to add that meeting to my agenda, right? I don't have to do anything. Again, the idea here is that much like your house with Nest, your entire life is being monitored, and certain events are singled out as meaningful events, and they are being suggested and proposed to you as something that can just be automated, right? And some hassle can be taken out of the system. Google, of course, draws on all of these sensors that it runs, and it draws on all of the systems that it has put in place. So it analyzes, for example, how many steps you take every day, because your Google Now system comes in your smartphone, and your smartphone has an accelerometer, so your phone actually knows how much you're walking because it knows when you're walking. So at the end of each month, Google now shows you a little card if you have enabled location tracking in your phone, and it tells you that you have walked this month, 10 miles. Last month you walked 8 miles. Good, your mileage has improved by 20%. Or it shows you the opposite, saying that you're not walking enough. Perhaps you should consider walking because there is the obesity problem and whatnot. But basically, if you take that logic a little bit further, you realize that once all of the sensors are more or less controlled in one way or another by Google or its affiliates, so Google doesn't have to build the smart mattress to profit from its sensors, all sorts of other predictive interventions become possible. So it becomes possible for Google not just to tell you that you are walking this month 20% more, 20% less. It also becomes possible for Google to tell you that, well, perhaps if you don't drink that glass of red wine at dinner, your chance of getting a heart attack would increase or decrease by 15% based on all the other data that it has collected about you, including how much you sleep, including how much you walk, and including more or less everything that's happening in your house, because Google is the company that controls all the sensors in your house, right? That is, again, for a lot of people in Germany, that might sound like nightmare. This is the commercial model of Silicon Valley that a lot of people are buying into. I mean, this is the hassle-free future that sensors can help us build. So what Google Now has done, and by the way, you understand where I'm driving with this Google Now analogy. Google Now basically makes search obsolete because much of the data that is gathered about you will be used to predict your information needs at a certain point in time. So if the system knows that you're standing next to a cinema, you don't actually have to go and search for what's on at that cinema because Google Now will automatically show you what's there on show tonight, right? And it actually does if you use Google Now, right? Which means that search itself is becoming obsolete, right? It's becoming obsolete in its current or prior form of people going to a search box and typing something in and getting results, because many of their information needs are being predicted in advance and are being satisfied, I would argue, with actually quite some accuracy, right? Which means that any company that hopes to beat Google with a better algorithm is probably not going to make it for the sole reason that it's not the algorithm that right now accounts for the quality of its results. It's the ability to control the sensors and to gather the data that they generate, right? Which also means that much of the current debate in German, which focuses on anti-competitive behavior of Google, misses the point. That it's not so much about opening up this playing field and making sure that other companies can provide a better algorithm. It's not the algorithm, right? And I would argue that it's not the algorithm even if you stick to search. At this point, it's so personalized, and it draws on so much of the data that Google has collected about us that any debate about trying to lessen our dependence on it has to consider the role of data and the role of sensors, because ultimately I don't think that you can treat those two differently and separately from each other. Because ultimately who controls the sensors will control the data, and right now whoever controls them, it's not the citizens, right? To say as much. So to abstract from the Google Nest and the Google Now examples, we can think of the new forms of governance that they open up. And clearly you can see, and by governance I don't mean global governance, I mean governments more in the sense of sort of governmentality and the ways in which human behavior can actually be administered or manipulated for particular ends. So if you look at what's happening in our education or in our health system or in our debates about even fighting crime, much of the debate right now is focused on big data, and it's focused on sensors, and it's focused on the Internet of Things for a number of reasons. But I would argue that the main reason why the focus is on them is because the kind of politics and the kind of governance that they enable conforms really well with the vision for political transformation that is currently in high demand today. And that vision presupposes that most problems have to be tackled by individuals and by consumers in some kind of individualized, optimistic fashion, perhaps by adjusting their own behavior preemptively to whatever constraints and concerns and symptoms they might develop. So if you think about health, the reason why there is so much excitement about the role of Silicon Valley in all of this, you hear all this excitement about wearables, the idea that your shirts will have sensors that will monitor your heart rate and it will tell you that you need to exercise more, and all of the, you don't even have to go to the level of the shirt. I mean, now if you look at the recent product launches from Apple, your new iPhone incorporates all of the sensors for health tracking. The reason why this sounds so exciting is because it fits very well into a vision of politics where it's the individuals who are increasingly asked to suffer the burden of caring for their own health. Right? And in part, that has to do with the fact that the welfare state or whatever is left for it doesn't really have much money left to deliver the kind of services that have been traditionally expected of it. So we have to rely, first of all, on putting more and more responsibility on the shoulders of individual citizens, but second, we also have to rely on this perpetual continuous monitoring and preemptive interventions because we cannot even afford to deal with the problems once they develop. So if you look at the situation in Britain, for example, where there are a lot of debates about the future of the National Health Service, there you see a think tank after think tank publishing a study that basically says the same thing. And what they say is that, well, we don't have the money to keep paying for everybody to the same amount that we used in the past. So we need to basically make sure that our healthcare delivery system is outcomes-based. And how do you make it outcomes-based? You start monitoring everybody's behavior and making sure that people who do receive benefits actually put in some work for it. So if you are a fat person on health insurance, we want to make sure that you actually go to the gym. And how do we make sure that you go to the gym? Well, because you use a smart card to enter the gym, or because your phone actually indicates where it is that you go. So a lot of this systems that now, a lot of these reports that are thinking about the future of healthcare delivery, for them, the way to deal with the fiscal crisis is very simple. It's that you just basically rely on technology to make sure that citizens themselves are not just encouraged to take matters into their own hands, which again, with extensive monitoring becomes possible. But to us, it's sold very often as emancipatory because it allows us to get away from the doctors and the health system, and there is still this anti-institutional discourse that emerged in the 70s that informs a lot of this sort of anti-authority rhetoric. But the second component to this is, of course, that there is no any other option, right? It's the ideological emancipatory rhetoric that surrounds the use of such devices is, of course, very interesting to analyze, but it's not as if we can convince the authorities or the think tanks producing those reports that the reports are political and they put the individual rather than the collective at the center of the narrative. I mean, even if you make that message very coherent, there is just no money to pay for that stuff, right? So, and that's the argument that they will give you straight away. But I would argue that this is also the broader logic that applies to other types of projects that we're seeing across the board. If you look at New York City, for example, which now is famed for relying on big data to distribute the work of its fire inspectors unit. I mean, the way in which it works is that they do analyze a lot of data about fires that happened in the past. They try to understand where fires are likely to happen in the future based on all the data that has been accumulated. And now that you can put sensors onto buildings, you'll accumulate even more data. And they basically dispatch the limited staff that they have, which, because of shrinking budgets, now is 5 people and not 50, to buildings that now rank high on the priority list, without developing any causal model for understanding why those buildings are more dangerous than others, because they don't have time for causality, and frankly speaking, they don't want to bother with it, right? So as long as they know how to distribute their limited resources better, they just distribute it and that's it, right? And I would argue that if you apply that model more broadly to other domains of life, where the abundance of data has allowed us to basically sidestep basic questions and basic questioning of why do problems exist, right? Why do our healthcare, education, or many other systems do not deliver? That's what politics used to be about, right? It was about trying to understand what lies at the heart of the problem, whether it's the power of companies, or the power of lobbyists, or lack of regulation, you name it. There was a very long laundry list. Some of that list is still with us, and we hear about it in the media on a daily basis. But the way in which Silicon Valley and a lot of the entrepreneurs in its universe, in its orbit, answered that question is by basically saying there is no need for causality because we can control one layer, which is actually most effective in resolving many of those problems, and that level is the level of the citizen. So instead of trying to investigate, why a problem like obesity exists, you can develop many causal models. You can say that obesity exists because there is inadequate public infrastructure in certain places, so people cannot get to farmers markets, or they cannot walk, or there is just too much reliance on cars. I mean, if you look at some of the, for example, work in critical health studies and sociology of health, in urban geography and critical geography in the 70s and 80s, it was precisely about revealing the social and political factors that would account for something like obesity. What's happening now is that a lot of that work is being set aside. The assumption is not that it's irrelevant, but it's that those factors are very hard to change, while the behavior of individuals is extremely easy to change because, again, we know so much about them because we monitor them on a daily basis, and we can steer their behavior by those nudging interventions that Google now shows you on your phone, by Nest-like optimization of your household, by constant manipulation of how much you sleep and when you wake up and so forth. This is the tangible level that is very easy to basically think of with and control. And my fear is that in pursuing this opportunities of optimization, a lot of us have actually bought into the rhetoric that this can actually substitute politics, and that can actually substitute higher level interventions in the political life, right? So that we do become, in a sense, dependent on Nest to solve our energy problem, or to solve our healthcare problem in the case of Google Now and other products, but we solve it in a very particular manner, right? I mean, even in Germany here, you would grasp that energy politics is not just about optimizing your thermostat, right? In this city and in Hamburg, there have been huge debates over the last decade or so about the status of electricity ownership, who owns the grid, right? With cities and citizens trying to bring it back, not because they thought that it wouldn't work or would work with a smart thermostat, but because they saw that it's the status of this utility that actually influences the outcome, right? And the political debate was about the ownership, whether it should be owned by citizens and the city, or whether it should be owned by big private energy and water companies. The reason why I'm saying this is that as we kind of buy into this Californian ideology of relying on apps to solve our problems, we risk ending up with a system that is highly efficient, but it has taken other political levers off the table, in a sense, right? In that the political process itself is getting reduced to the level of the app, right? And it's getting reduced to a point where, having accumulated so much data, Google can, in fact, make the most important interventions in health, energy, and other sectors. And then the question for us really becomes, what is left for others to do? I mean, why would you even want to have a Ministry of Energy or Ministry of Health if they don't have as much expertise and data as Google? No, but and to me, it's a big question for the reasons that I would want to explain. I actually think that a lot of Google's critics in Europe, I mean, they make a perfectly good argument with regards to its business model. I mean, yes, their model is not favorable to competitors, like the business model of any other company. But if you think about it, the fact that Google tries to basically get into its hand into any other domain It makes perfect sense. And for this simple reason that the more data it accumulates from various domains, the more relevant its results get. I mean, to me, it seems obvious that when I'm standing next to, a pizzeria and I'm searching for pizza, my results will be better if Google knows my geographical location than if Google doesn't know my geographical location, right? Those results will probably be better if Google knows also, what I like to eat, right? But the reason why I'm saying that is not because I want to sound like a Google apologist. All I'm trying to say is that there are huge economies of scale actually here, and there are lots of synergies in having one actor do all of that data collection, right? And then if you end up with 10 Googles, smaller ones, one of them runs Maps, one of them runs Gmail, one of them runs Search, you will end up in an environment where so much data cannot be accumulated, but its potential social value also cannot be unlocked, because it's only by getting all of the data together that you can actually derive the kind of synergies that I'm talking about, where you actually would be able to derive relevance and greater relevance from the fact that you can integrate geolocational data with email data, with the data that relates to energy, food, and other types of consumptions. All I'm trying to say here is that if you really want to think outside of the Google model and the Google bubble, we have to start thinking about the ways in which we can actually create a legal and economic regime in which some of that data can actually be accumulated in a way that would not presuppose it being locked up in Google's vaults or the vaults of that company in Portland, Oregon, that then went and sold that data to Portland. To me, it's not even, it's not certain whether Portland should have actually paid for that data, right? Because what's happening now is that a lot of the data that is being gathered by these companies is being either sold back to the cities, to the governments, or is being given as an act of goodwill. So just a few weeks ago, Uber struck a deal with the city of Boston, where they basically said that, well, you don't like us in Boston for reasons we can understand, but here's a gesture of goodwill. We'll give you all the data we collect about rides and trips in Boston, and we hope that that data will be incorporated by Boston's urban planners precisely to plan better and ease congestion and to better understand traffic flows, right? And for me, it's clearly a good idea that planners now have more data, but it's not obvious that that's the best possible way to get it. And if cities actually started from scratch, if they did not have this infrastructure, and I didn't even talk about the smart city, but the smart city is an extension of this Nest and Google Now paradigm to the city at large, so that your bus stop will be more or less as personalized and anticipatory as your smart bed or your Google Now app. But the point here is that we have to figure out what kind of regime, and by regime I mean regime for data ownership and for the ownership of the sensors and of the underlying infrastructure, would make sure that there is as much value that that data delivers to citizens and communities as it does to the companies who run on top of it. So I wouldn't actually be against an idea or a project whereby we would be able to have data that does belong to citizens and that does belong to cities and that does belong to governments be stored in some kind of a vault for which companies would actually come and pay a license fee and then build a service on top of that data. I mean, that's how we would want to build a modern service with all of the privacy by design and decentralized encrypted features built into it. And then, if you are Google and you want to come in and build a service on top of that data, yes, you would be able to come in and do it. And you would perhaps build an extremely good personalized service that would actually pay for it. But I'm not sure that the right way to do it is to say, well, you get all the data, Google, and then we figure out what we'll do about it. Because as I said, if we really push the logic on which Google operates to its ultimate conclusion, it will be in every single field. Like, there is no way that it will not enter an industry like insurance and banking, provided it can survive all of the regulatory challenges, for the sole reason that it understands risks at this point much better, at least on the individual level, much better than many insurance companies and banks. Because again, it tracks much more about you than anybody. With the smoke detector, that is smart smoke detector that Nest runs, being in your house, it probably knows much more about the risk that your house will get on fire than any other company, right? And the point I'm making here is that we have to radically intervene and figure out a way in which some of that data can actually be reclaimed. And I have somewhat of a vision, which perhaps is the subject for another talk. But to conclude, I think the positive vision that we need to have in mind is the vision of a project like one of my favorite ones in Finland, in Helsinki. It's called Katsu Plus. And the way in which it works is that it's a mix between Uber, a system that does rely on sensors in your smartphones and in the city at large, and public transportation. And it provides a service which is highly personalized. It's a system that would pick you up where you are because you place your request via your smartphone, but it will put you in a minivan with 4 or 5 other passengers. Your route will be calculated based on your stated preferences by an algorithm, and you would pay 3 or 4 euros to go essentially on a highly personalized bus route, which didn't exist before, but which exists now because the system knows that there are 4 or 5 people wanting to go in that direction, right? And of course, a company like Uber can also provide that service. What I don't want to happen is for citizens not to be able to organize that service themselves, right? Because it's key to be able to get that data and compare your own data with data of other citizens. This is how political change also happens. I don't want just to know how I'm optimizing energy in my own house and what I'm eating and how I'm traveling. I also want to know about the experiences of other people in my neighborhood, in my city, in my street, because having those shared grievances is what leads to political action. And the problem is that unless we manage to get hold of that data, that political action is channeled into apps. So instead of talking to our neighbors who might have some similar problems and then pushing for different kinds of political change, we are encouraged to download yet another app and engage in yet another form of optimization that will solve our problem, but it will solve it in a way that has nothing to do with the political, if you will, in the way in which I envision it. So I will stop here with this positive vision. I think the positive vision here is very important. We have to be able to use those algorithms and sensors and use those smart technologies and devices to have a highly effective, decentralized, personalizable system, whether it's for public communication, for health, for energy, or something else. But it has to be done on terms that also favor citizens and cities and not just companies and governments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. I think we have 10 minutes, 15 minutes? 15 minutes for questions? Yeah. That's the microphone.
Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask you a question about the current debate about Vorratsdatenspeicherung, or the data retention debate in Germany. Yes. And after your talk, it seems very arcane and archaic because there's this whole level of sensor data that you've revealed that is already happening. In the States, less so here. And I wish you would talk a little bit about that, the cultural clash between that Silicon Valley and the data retention in Germany, and also the relation between state and ownership by private individuals.
Sure.
If you could flesh that out a little bit.
Sure.
Thank you.
So I think one of the reasons why there is, again, such a opposition to anything involving data in Germany, I mean, part of that has to do with historical reasons, which Frank alluded to in his introductory remarks. But I think the reason why it's so hard for us to think of a way in which data can contribute to a better society is because right now, the only model of reference that we have is Silicon Valley. What data plays one role, it enables better advertising. That's all it does, right? And the reason why many of the systems are insecure, why your email is insecure, why NSA can tap into it, for this whole reason, because if it wasn't, then Google wouldn't be able to provide it, right? Because the only reason why it's insecure is because Google's entire business model is based on its ability to look inside your data and to sell you an ad, to show you an ad and then sell you something. So we can easily think of an infrastructural system that will not have those defects, but somebody will have to pay for that infrastructure. And since there is, at least I don't sense that excitement about paying for infrastructure, including in Germany, we're stuck with Silicon Valley, right? And as we're stuck with Silicon Valley, if that's the paradigm out of which we cannot exit, then I think the frustrations and the anxieties about data protection are actually fully legitimate. Right? Yeah, I can argue in Germany. I can argue that, yes, they, in a sense, prevent more progressive and more forward-looking interventions from even being discussed. But it's a question of money. It's a question of politics. And I think a lot of the work, there is a great work that people like Frank are doing with, in his organization with regards to technical matters of encryption and also a lot of work on digital rights. But somebody needs to start campaigning on questions of infrastructure, because without that, not much will come out. And that maybe partly would answer your question about ownership. I think much of the fight here would depend on the ability of people interested in digital issues of joining forces with all those other campaigns that are opposing privatization of electricity and water and other resources, and not just in Germany. I mean, in Italy, there was a successful campaign to oppose the privatization of water a couple of years ago, including a referendum on the national level. I don't see those campaigns, unfortunately, on digital matters as often as I would like to see them. I mean, there is a great discussion about Snowden and what it means and civil liberties, and in Germany, there is still a lot of attention to those matters. But to me, it seems like that debate is blind to the key issue, why that surveillance is possible. And it's possible precisely because there is no money for an alternative infrastructure that will not have those loopholes.
Yeah, hi, thank you for your talk. I'm a big fan of your writing as well, and I have to admit that your talk tonight left me a little bit baffled, because it seems no longer maybe as skeptical of sort of the promise of big data. So if I understood you correctly, you sort of transition over here to maybe that camp of solutionists that say that if the data is just in the right hands, if it's in the people's hands,
sure,
then it might be more useful. But what if it's not? What if it's just a good business model in
sure,
the end? And what if it really isn't that great to run a state and to run a government and so on?
Well, I mean, look, I don't think that any alternative model of social organization that would kind of reject hypercapitalism as it exists today would be possible without some degree of planning, whatever it would be. And if you buy into that paradigm, there is no way that data would not be useful to that effort. So in that sense, it has nothing to do with big data that's currently sold by Silicon Valley. Like, it just has to do with data. I mean, there is no way for a community to manage its own resources in an effective way without relying on market mechanism in a way that does not compensate for that market mechanism for some other kind of ability to generate information and knowledge and insight. And that's a debate that has been going on ever since 1920s with the socialist calculation debate, and which we can go into if there is any interest here. But that's the argument. So I mean, again, it's not back to. I can tell you historically answer how that evolution in my thinking happened, and I think it happened with me trying to understand where political change can come from. And to me, it's obvious that it's not going to come without being attached to some political project. And I'm not sure that trying to articulate a vision, as I've done in some of my previous work, that is not tied to some political project would get us any farther. Right? So in that sense, for me, it's obvious that communities that would be able to run their own parts of their own, electricity or transportation or health or education or you name it, to me, it does sound like somewhat emancipatory. Like, yeah, I mean, to me, it seems like a basic insight. So in that sense, I do want those people to be able to organize some of their own activities in the way in which they want, by using the data that they themselves generate. I mean, there are some early encouraging sites. If you look, for example, at the citizen sensors project in Amsterdam, for example, coming out of Den Haag. But it's this kind of sensors you can attach to the city to get a better understanding of pollution or any of the other big weather trends to kind of circumvent the epistemic authority of the planner. And this is also a very big issue. To me, it's not obvious that having that data go from the bicycling company to the planner is the step in the right direction. I would actually want that data to go to the citizens first, and then perhaps go to the planner, right? So, I mean, there are all sorts of issues here which have to do with what's your attitude to power, what's your attitude to authority, and what's your attitude to how to actually get some of those ideas into into action, because otherwise we'll be just debating alternatives that are not pegged to any political project. And without being pegged to any political project, none of them have a chance of being implemented.
A wonderful talk and actually a wonderful and inspiring vision. I'm curious on 2 points. The Helsinki example and the Portland examples are both, as you just said, examples of people's data going to governments.
Yes.
Towns in this case, but governments go beyond the towns. If you want it to go to the citizens before it gets to the governments, it's a middle step. What is your vision of the governance process and structure? Who are the stakeholders in it of this, let's call it disintermediated data generation and absorption process?
Maybe a good way to start it would be to look at that structure right now. I mean, the way in which it functions right now is that you have Silicon Valley, which does a lot of data collection and data organization, and then actors like NSA step in and get that data after it has been structured and organized, right? So that process is happening in a way, right? What I would like to propose, and here, of course, my vision is far more utopian than I would ever before acknowledge in public. It requires a state that would tie its own hands or would want to at least impose severe limits on its ability to get that data indiscriminately, which is what's happening now with the amount of data collection that does not perhaps match the level or the nature of the threat. Because now, since that data can be collected easily and in a very unproblematic fashion, it's collected without much of discrimination, right? With the exception of the Data Protection Directive in Europe, which opens up a somewhat different debate. So, I mean, I can try to spell out that vision, what it would mean, but again, I'm not utopian about the possibility of that happening, right? Because currently, I would not expect even countries and governments in Europe to say, yes, we would want that to happen. This is why I think the only level at which it's realistic to implement it currently would be the level of the city, where there is still some space and where the data does not revolve so much around questions of terrorism and, it's a lot of that is even not just the city, it's also the neighborhood. It's the data about energy consumption, transportation, and stuff like that. And from there, we can continue building further and further. At the level of the state, again, it's not an impossible vision, but that would need to be a state that would lie somewhere very far from either Western Europe as it is now or America. So it might be it might be Brazil, but again, it would require it would require a state that I'm not sure currently exists. Which again is not necessarily a bad thing, because I think that could be the problem that we have in this space is that the political movements that pop up, the Pirate Party would be one example, have interesting positions on small issues. They don't have a broad vision for broader social transformation. So in this sense, I don't think it's a bad thing that these people will start thinking at least about those matters, because this big picture stuff is missing. So I'm not particularly concerned that the vision is too utopian, because the political movements that should be addressing these issues do not have a big vision. They have a small vision on how to transform copyright law, which I admire and occasionally agree with, but it does not transform into anything larger than that.
I'm also a bit baffled by the conclusion of your talk, because you said you were talking, you wanted to analyze the consequences of this technological development. And I was reminded of an interview I saw of Sidney Pollack, the film director. Yes. And the interviewer asked him why he decided to do a film director, when his parents want him to be a pharmacist. And he says this wonderful thing that, to be a pharmacist would have meant to look at life through like a glass pipe, where every day is the same, and that felt a little boring. So the way that the technology is evolving, it's pretty clear that it's turning if you want to be positive, it's turning everybody into a pharmacist, with the problem that there will be no more patients because everybody's going to be in such a great shape because of the smartphone will tell you every day what they should eat and drink. And if you want to be negative, it turns your private home into a permanent courtroom where there is this judge called smartphone that continuously tells you what you've done wrong, what you should do better, and et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
And so this is certainly, this in 1948, they would be considered a dystopia. And in fact, Google has very much exceeded the role of the Big Brother in the Orwell movie.
Sure. So let me, I think I get where you're going. And it's, let me put it that way. The paths on which we are currently at, I don't think it has much to do with technology. It's definitely enabled by technology, but much of what's happening in the house of the smart, citizen or consumer, what's happening in the smart city, what's happening, in your smartphone when it tells you to start walking more, has everything to do with what's happening at the level of the state and what's happening with capitalism today. And it just happens that the ability to tap into a lot of customer and consumer data has turned companies into predictive machines. They have understood what is the current state of you that would be most profitable to them, and they will make sure that you stay in that stage as long as they can draw an income from you. Look, the perfect paradigm for this are the casinos in Las Vegas. Perfect paradigm. In the past, all they did, you come in, they study you maybe, with the card that you put into your machine, and that's it. Now, they track everything. They track you through partnerships with sites like Facebook. They track you based on every single data point like any other company. Why? Because they want to make you an offer you cannot refuse. So they tell you, we know that your favorite artist is coming to Las Vegas in 2 weeks. We'll get you free tickets. Just come to Las Vegas, stay in our casino. How do they know your favorite artist? Because they have a partnership with Spotify, which tracks your music. Right? This is the paradigm. The paradigm is that you use the data collected about customers to get customers to spend more. Right? In the case of casinos, you clearly see that perhaps that's not so great as compared to books that we buy from Amazon. But again, this is not, to me, a feature of the technology or algorithms or sensors. It's the way in which the current stage of capitalism, and if you want to state the transformation of the welfare state with nudging and behavioral economics and everything else, that's what they do with those technologies. If you look at the utopian vision, Marxist or any other, of social transformation, automation there is not a bad thing. You need automation because that will give you the free time you need to fish in the morning and whatever it was, read in the afternoon. You would want automation to run. I have no problem with automation, but again, I don't want automation that, again, precludes other forms of political life from even shaping up, which I'm afraid is the case when both your smart home and smart city are so smart. Then you never discover that your neighbors have the same problems because those problems are solved before you actually realize that they exist. So in this sense, you can say that, yes, I'm buying their vision, but I'm not. I don't think that, I don't want to go and spend a lot of time doing things that can be done by technology. To me, it seems crazy. Yes, I would rather use technology that is privacy protected and secure and encrypted, but I don't buy that comparison, right? So to me, it's not Google, it's not the internet that's making you stupid, right? It's not, it's the wrong level of explanation, right? So in that sense, I'm more than happy to reappropriate some of the technology for a very different political and social agenda. As much baffling as it may sound, but of course, if you buy into the history has ended and there is no other paradigm and all we are stuck with are 5 companies trying to sell us more stuff, then yeah, the vision is pretty horrible. Then yes, disconnect.
Yes, thank you. Very inspiring. I have one question, though. If I understand you right, the vision that you have, an important part of the vision that you have is owning your own data, or is the ownership of data. And ownership requires identity and authentication, which is a hard problem to solve in the internet. So I wonder, how do you propose to solve that and to approach that, and who should manage this?
It's a good question. Again, I'd just like to clarify that by ownership, I do not mean the type of ownership where you would be necessarily able to sell your own data, which is a vision that a lot of people have in MIT, in Davos. Jaron Lanier has that vision. I don't want us to create a permanent auction system where, like that auto-tune function of Nest, which always searches for the most optimal deal on energy consumption, we're always searching for the most optimal buyer for the song we're singing in the shower because somebody would like to buy that fact. Ownership can also mean that you own it, but you're not necessarily entitled to package it as a commodity and put it on the market, right? But the identity question is a hard one, and all I can say is that would be impossible without owning other layers of the stack, right? So you would need to do something about the sensors, you would need to do something about the underlying telecom infrastructure, but you would also need to do something about passports and smart IDs. So ultimately, that will be a debate that we are not having, but should be having. Estonia might have solved that problem somewhat, but the vision to which the Estonian ID card is the ideal prototype for the kind of vision that I have, I doubt it. But that would require thinking along the lines of how can you use the identity systems that we already carry, which are issued by the state, and tie them to all the other services that would be provided to us, whether it's transportation or health or something else. Now, in a lot of countries, including Germany, that would trigger a lot of very justified concerns about the abuse of that data by the state. So I'm not extremely optimistic about that vision, but it's not that if the state doesn't already get the data through other means. That's not a justification. It's just a suggestion that we have to think of a system that would not just establish Google, because otherwise Google will own the identity layer. And to me, and Facebook, which it already does, and I think that the Google Now, for example, is the way in which Google will come to own the identity. Because what they are now trying to do is that by integrating data from all of your other apps, so your Spotify music, your Netflix films, your Amazon books, everything that you use on other sites, Google Now will analyze it also, right? That's the basis of the new deal that they struck a few weeks ago with those companies. And if that's the case, then your Google profile does become the accumulation of everything. And in that case, again, my question is, who then needs the governments to issue IDs? If for all intents and purposes, it's your Facebook account that allows you to deal with Uber and Airbnb. If you have less than 100 friends on Airbnb, on Facebook, Airbnb would not allow you to authenticate yourself as a new user. If that's, and again, there is a question of identity here, and what happens to Uber customers, and the fact that we're all being ranked. Uber drivers rank us, Uber passengers. I mean, there are all sorts of other concerns I didn't even go into. But to me, the primary actors who are now being disrupted are precisely the governments. And it's the ability to preserve their core function, which was to issue identity at this point. And it's being taken away and slowly delegated to the market, not entirely. Clearly, you will not be able to pass the border with your Facebook profile. But it doesn't mean that they wouldn't ask for a Facebook profile at the border, as already happens in Iran.
The Obama administration is actually working on it.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Sure.
So,
Thank you so much.